Hi there, Evan here at the McChronicle for Friday, January 24th, 2020, where that future starts today. Candyman, the Bank of Canada, came out on Wednesday, dramatically reduced the growth forecast for Canada, said the Canadian economy is still slowing into 2020, and gave the market the indication that they're going to cut rates by the second quarter of this year. Some action though has happened in the bond market, which leads me to believe the bond market isn't calling necessarily for the start of another rate cut cycle, but saying this is going to be on one and wait. I'll show you here. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to overlay the three main yield curves that I'm following right now that further illustrate the point that this is a one and wait versus the start of an actual rate cut cycle. The first one I'm going to overlay on the screen here is the 3-month 5-year Canadian 3-month T-bill yield versus the Canadian 5-year bond yield. And as you can see, since the meeting, the 3-month yield is about flat, but the 5-year yield is down about 8 basis points, going into a further inversion. Next one I'm going to show, 3-month 10-year, 3-month T-bill yield again, versus the Canadian 10-year bond yield this time. 3-month is again flat, and the 10-year is down about 9 basis points. And this illustrates the point that I'm trying to make here, and that the longer you go out in duration, the more the yields are actually down. Last one I'm going to show. The Canadian 2-year bond yield versus the Canadian 10-year bond yield. This is the 2s, 10s. This is the main yield curve that most people actually are familiar with, that you hear about the most every day on TV, if they even mention it. And even here, the Canadian 2-year bond yield is down about 6 basis points, and the 10-year again is down about 9 basis points. Now here's the point I'm trying to make. The fact that the longer you go in duration, the more yields are down, what this is saying is that yes, growth is slowing. Bank of Canada admitted it in their statement, and the bond market is confirming it. And as I've mentioned on here a few times, the longer end of the yield curve is levered most to growth, the shorter end is levered most to central bank policy and inflation. So the longer end, it's going down because the economy is slowing down. As I've been mentioning on here the past 2 years, this shouldn't be a shock to anybody, and the bond market's confirming it. Now as far as the short end, there's two things at play here, or at least I interpret it as two things at play here. One, in the last couple of months, there's been a big pickup in inflation in Canada, especially in food and energy. And what the Bank of Canada is worried about, if they cut rates too fast, it'll drive down the Canadian dollar, and since the pricing of both of these is denominated in US dollars, a weaker Canadian dollar is going to stoke inflation even further here. So that's one thing. And two, central bank policy. As I've said on here a few times, my base case for what's going to happen over the next couple of months, in the data, it's going to give the optical illusion through Q1 and the early part of Q2 that the economy is stabilizing. So what's it going to do to the Bank of Canada? It's going to tell them this and be like, okay, inflation's still hot, growth is still okay, we don't have to cut rates here. And that's the main reason why I think the bond market is saying they're not going to have to cut until Q2 because of this. Now what do I think is going to happen after Q2, after the first rate cut? We have a saying in the bond market called fear the steepener. Let me explain. The long end starts falling faster than the short end as it seems like the economy is starting to slow down. So then they fall, and ultimately they invert. For the yield curve signal to work, to be a forward-looking indicator for recession, they have to be inverted for at least 3 months. Or in Canada's case, it's been about a year now. But anyways, then here's where the steepener part comes in. When they're inverted, and the bond market has a signal that the central bank is going to start cutting rates to get the economy out of a slowdown and or recession, which I think we're headed into, the short end falls off a cliff as rates are constantly cut in a hope to reflate the economy. After Q2, and actually, if you look at the yield curve signal, it's at the time when the bearish steepener happens that we're actually closest to a recession. In fact, typically, from the time the yield curve falls out of inversion into this bear steepener, we're usually only about 6 months from the actual recession being reported. That's how quick it is. And what I'm saying is that after Q2, when it seems like the economy is about to go into a recession, that's when that bear steepener is going to happen. And that's what I'm saying. So to summarize all this, the bond market as usual has it right. The Bank of Canada will do their first rate cut in Q2, and as throughout Q3 into Q4, etc., as the data starts getting worse and worse, the more it's going to be evidently apparent that the Bank of Canada is going to start massively cutting rates to reflate the economy, and the yield curve is going to reflect this. It was a lot to take in, I understand. But to quickly summarize here, the yield curve has it, in my opinion, exactly right. The central bank is going to wait until Q2 to cut rates. Then they're going to be a wait and see mode to see what the data tells them. And then by late Q3, early Q4 the latest, the data is going to tell them that we're about to head into a recession. Bank of Canada is going to start cutting rates a lot faster. The yield curve is going to refer this with the bear steepener. And then by early 2021 the latest, Main Street's going to know we're in a recession. That's all I'm going to say. Smash that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, follow both my Twitter accounts. And as always, my name is Evan. This is the McChronicle, where the future starts today.